Okay. All right. There we go. So we are in Jeremiah chapter 7 or 6. I mean, um, keep on good news. This is we're Jeremiah, and not that there's a lot of points that aren't, but we're still discussion. Remember that at the end of chapter, this idea, verse 30 and 31 of chapter 5 say, an appalling and horrible thing has happened in the land. The prophets prophesy falsely, and the protection. And then it says, my people love to have. Okay, so here's kind of the idea. This is what's happening. That they're saying, oh no, God isn't mad at you. You're doing okay. Nothing's going to happen. No problems. The priests are ruling according to that direction. You don't have to be faithful. It'll all be all right. All of that. And so God ends it, or Jeremiah ends the words of the Lord in chapter 5 with, but what will you do when the end comes? Chapter 5 verse 31 of Jeremiah. Okay. What will you do? Talk about the end. So chapter 6 verse 1 begins, flee for safety, O people of Benjamin, from the midst of Jerusalem. Now remember, this is an important element of this discussion, is that there are two tribes remaining at this point. The northern tribes have been taken off into Assyria, and the two tribes that made up the southern kingdom are Judah and Benjamin. Okay. In case you've ever wanted to think about it, the two tribes that had kings in the southern kingdom are both part of the southern kingdom still, because Saul was from Benjamin, David is from Judah, and every king of the southern kingdom from. Okay, so the first king of Israel was from Benjamin, and then every other king of the Davidic line is from the tribe of Judah. So they are the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom are all the other tribes who chose to break away during the reign of Rehoboam. The northern kingdom has been gone for somewhere between 80 and 100 years at this point. We don't know exactly, but something like that. Okay. So God is saying, flee for safety, O people of Benjamin, from the midst of Jerusalem. Blow the trumpet in Tekoa. Raise a signal on Beth Hacherem. So here is the picture. Flee. Sound the alarm. Raise the signals, because disaster's coming. Okay. Now, we know what is going on here. The Babylonians have left Babylon. This is what the prophet is seeing. The Babylonians have left Babylon. They have headed up over the northern edge of the Fertile Crescent. They have, at this point, this is in the future, and we need to understand this in the future, but this is the picture of the prophet. Remember that the Babylonians eventually conquer the Assyrians. So they get all of their land, which would have included the northern kingdom, which would have been an Assyrian province. The southern kingdom, in some ways, was a vassal. They were still their own country, but they had made treaties with Babylon and all of this sort of stuff. Well, they break them, and Babylon says, okay, here we come. And they come over, and disaster is coming out of the north. Okay. And great destruction. So this really is kind of the idea. They are burning and breaking everything they come across. The lovely and delicately bred I will destroy, the daughter of Zion.
Other people don't believe they're coming, so they
Is part of it. This is what the prophet is getting at. You've said that no, God's not going to do anything. Here's what it's going to look like. Oh my! But notice, he's speaking of the daughter of Zion. He's speaking of his bride, Judah, who is about to be destroyed. She's lovely and delicate, but here it comes. I'm going to destroy her. And her beauty and all of that isn't going to save her. Okay? Shepherds with their flocks shall come against her. Pasture, each in his place. They're going to cut their flocks and their herds, and they're going to camp around it. They're going to besiege.
This is coming to the southern kingdom.
Yes, this is coming to the southern kingdom. And then we have these two statements like this. Prepare war against her. Arise, let us attack at noon. Woe to us, for the day declines. So let's attack at noon before it starts getting dark. The shadows of evening are lengthening. Arise and let us attack by night and destroy her palaces. So both day and night, they're going to be at risk. Then in verse 6, for the hosts, cut down her trees, cast up a siege mound against Jerusalem. So here is the idea, and this is a very important discussion of ancient Eastern battle tactics. Okay, and really you could move all the way to medieval. It's a little different, but understand that Jerusalem is on a hill. Ancient Eastern cities were designed in such a way that they were in a position of fortification. It wasn't just walls and all of that, but they had built the city in a place that would be easily defended. So there were several ways. When you get further into Middle Ages culture, you have what are called siege engines. You have towers that they would use and ladders and all of that. But typically in this time, what they would do is they would begin to build a large ramp. Dirt and all of that they dig up. They'd add wood and trees and stuff like that to provide, all of that. And they would build a ramp that would eventually come over the wall. The best example, this comes several hundred years later. I will get pictures for you for later, but there is a city in Israel called, it was a building built by Herod, and it was called Masada. And if you ever read the story, Masada was built on a huge plateau. Okay. And after Herod's death, a group of Jewish zealots took possession of it. And about 40 years after Jerusalem fell, they had collected their wives and family. They were going to come take care of them. Well, they're on a plateau that raises 600 to 700 feet off the desert floor. And there is one place in the entire plateau where anything other than a mountain goat could climb it. And the pathway was set where two people would have a difficult time walking side by side up this path. And at the top, they had cisterns that could collect rainwater. They had mass stores of grain. They had all sorts of stuff prepared for this. 2 years. And the Romans, what they did is they came in and they built 2 rings around Masada. They built an inner ring of soldiers and they built an outer ring of soldiers. The inner ring of soldiers was to keep anybody from getting out. The outer ring of soldiers was to keep anybody from getting in. And then they began to build siege ramps. And by the way, from aerial pictures, even today, you can see they built it early on Saturday. Because on Saturday, at that point, the Jews were not allowed to make war on Saturday, so they could build without any worry about arrows or rocks or anything flying out at them. The story goes that they finally built this siege ramp. It took them 2 years to build the siege ramp to the walls. The night before they breached the walls, all the people of Masada killed themselves.
Wow.
But yet they made sure to note they had another 12 months worth of food. They weren't out of food. They weren't any of that. And so, but understand that this is what God is picturing. What he's picturing is the walls of Jerusalem standing there. Certainly they would have attacked the gate and all of that, but any ancient Near Eastern city would have had all of its protection kind of focused on the gate. A lot of times it's interesting to read some of the stories. They would have the gate, and then they'd have another set of wall that came out a little ways and ran parallel to the city wall for 100, 150 yards. Okay. Almost always it went the same in the discussion of that a right-hander would have his sword arm on the outside. Okay. By the way, when you look at medieval castles, the spiral staircases are designed for the same thing. That if you're coming up the stairs, then your sword arm is towards the inside, and it makes it hard to swing it. But it's easier for the person up coming down to swing. Okay, there's a lot of those kind of details in the fortifications. The reason you would run a wall parallel to the wall of your city is so that people from up top can throw things. And you have a narrow path that only 3 or 4 guys can walk side by side, while the people up on top of the wall are throwing things down at you. But what does it do? It makes it harder to take the city. So a lot of armies would build a siege ramp. They would build a ramp that comes over the wall. And then you have the city. Okay, this because the other part of a siege is certainly a discussion we will get in later. Is since a siege mound takes a long time, the other purpose of a siege is to starve them out. Okay, we know that the final siege of Jerusalem in 586 BC in that area was long and drawn out. And God even brings up in some of the prophetic writings that by the time it is over, they are eating their own dead to survive. Happens. No one comes in. No. So guess what that means? You can't bring any food. You can't bring in any water. Now, for Jerusalem, that's not as big of a deal because they have an aquifer directly under the city. But you can't bring in water, you can't bring in food, you can't bring in. And so eventually you become so destitute and broken that guess what? You can't defend the city anymore. And that's what God is beginning to talk about. Cut down her trees, cast up a siege mound against Jerusalem. This is the city that must be punished. So what is God saying? You are my means of punishing this city. He's talking to a foreign power. On is to punish my people. And then it goes on. There is nothing but oppression within her. So it's completely broken. They are oppressing one another. They are cheating one another. They are treating each other badly. They are not following me at all. And then it goes to this. It says, as a well keeps its water fresh, so she keeps fresh her evil. Now, let's make sure we understand this. if you take and let's look at a cistern, for example. Okay. Now, a cistern, the idea is it's deep enough, no light, that kind of stuff, which keeps the water okay longer. Outflow, what happens to it? It gets stagnant and nasty. A well goes down to an underground water source that has movement. There is movement, which keeps the water fresh and clean. So here is what they're saying. In the same way that you have a well full of water, that it'll stay fresh because of the movement, Jerusalem keeps churning their evil to keep it nice and fresh.
Sounds kind of like a.
Okay, so this is the idea. It's not even old evil. They keep pouring more evil in. It's kind of the discussion of the Dead Sea. Now, understand, why does the Dead Sea, why is it called that? It has a bunch of inlets and no outlet. So the Jordan River flows down into the Dead Sea. And as it flows down through the mountain paths and all of that, it picks up salt, picks up sodium, it picks up minerals, and it dumps. The Dead Sea has no water coming out of it. The only way it loses water is through evaporation. When water evaporates, what doesn't go with the water? The salt. And so every year the Dead Sea gets a little saltier. This is off subject, but you cannot drown in the Dead Sea.
That's why you slept on, because of the salt.
You can't drown. You cannot. You have to put weights on to sink. The water, there's so much.
Yeah, I'd like to go there and try that out.
Interestingly enough, it's called the Dead Sea, but it's not completely dead. There are places along the shore where there are little pools where the salt level is not as high, and you will find small fish and some things like.
Is it high in minerals there?
Oh my word, yes. In fact, a lot of the countries around it use it to collect salt.
You take like these lakes around here in my road. There's a lake and it's got this white layer around it because it's salty.
Around Portales, they have the salt marshes,
Yeah.
which is the same kind of idea. Now, they're not anywhere near as salty because they still have fish and all of that. The Dead Sea, and it has a higher salt concentration than the ocean. Its salt level is so high that it's basically toxic. The salt level's so high.
I used to buy products that were like lotions and all that kind of stuff, Body Works. That's called a Hava, and it's from the Dead Sea.
And
It's real
it,
expensive.
yeah,
I can't buy it anymore.
I understand. But the idea here is that understand that they keep pouring more evil in. It's not evil. It's they keep filling it back up with new evil. Okay. Violence and destruction are heard within her. Sickness and wounds are ever before me. So notice, every time I look, there's violence and destruction. Every time I look, there's sickness and wounding. Be warned, O Jerusalem, lest I turn from you in disgust, lest I make you a desolation and uninhabited land. Here's what's going to happen. Be warned, if you don't change your ways now.
So does Jerusalem exist today?
Yes. In fact, on the same spot. Now it's bigger. Today you will find there's the old city and then there's the new city. But the old city is actually on the same spot. There's a few differences. For example, the Dome on the Rock, which is a huge Muslim temple, is sitting on according to tradition, is sitting on the spot of the temple.
I heard that Jerusalem is gorgeous.
It is. Now
I've never seen it, but I've heard people.
it's pretty desolate now. Part of that is because some of their enemies decided to cut down all the trees, which changes your weather pattern. The Romans were vicious when they wanted you gone. But understand that what's really going on, and this is a important, telling discussion. God told them all the way back in Deuteronomy, if you will obey me, your land will be full of blessing. Your land will be full of, it will truly be a land flowing of milk and honey. If you don't obey me, then it will come to a point that everybody who walks into your land will recognize the fact that I've cursed you.
You're full of tumbleweeds.
Wasn't that like the contract that they had?
It was. That is a very telling moment. He says, if you don't obey, I will send enemies against you. I will send plagues against you. I will send pestilence against you. I will send famine against you. And after I've completely booted you off the property, and that's exactly how it's phrased, then people will come by and go, wow, what happened here?
Really pissed off God over there.
And that's exactly it. By the way, we've discussed this a little bit before, but there is a Messianic Jewish writer named Jonathan Cahn. He talks about that one of the discussions that comes up is that there will be a man who's a messenger who will come and he will proclaim what God has done to this land that has been disobedient. And a man who would fit that description, and I'm going to say it that way because it's prophecy. We actually know him pretty well. He was an American writer who we know as Mark Twain. And he traveled to Jerusalem. He traveled to Israel, and he looked around. And in his book, he says, this looks like a place that's been cursed by God. Well, from that point on, the movement towards Jerusalem becoming back began. And that's exactly how the Deuteronomy discussion says. There will come a point where it will be so desolate that those will come from outside and go, wow, what happened here? And then the discussion, and then I'll start to bring you back. And that's exactly what has happened. But understand, when we talk about the desolation of Israel, the discussion is they were not obedient. This is the punishment for their disobedience. Don't forget that we discussed this on Wednesday night. When the spies walked into the land of Canaan, it says they were in the southern area, which would have been this area. It would have been the area of the tribe of Judah. And it says that they walked through and they found a vineyard or wild grapes. We don't know whether they were wild or whether it was a vineyard. But it said they found a single bunch of grapes that was so big, they had to put it on a pole and carry it between two people. So we're talking
Huge.
100 pounds of grapes in a single bunch. Okay. And they come back, and before they throw a fit about the giants and all that, they go, oh my word, they were right. It's like milk and honey flow out of that land. It is so fertile. Everything will grow there. It's going to be great. But there's these really big guys we don't think God can handle.
That's where they screw.
Okay. and this comes back to Deuteronomy, and I bring it up several times, is because both Isaiah and Jeremiah are filtering all of their prophecies through the lens of Deuteronomy. Okay, we've talked about it a little bit. We're going to hit Deuteronomy on Wednesday night in a week from now, but all of the major history of Joshua, Judges, 1 Samuel, 2 Samuel, 1 Kings, 2 Kings, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther, all of those particular books of history are all filtered through the lens of Deuteronomy. The is looking back at Deuteronomy and looking at the way the people act in comparison with Deuteronomy. Okay, for example, in Deuteronomy, one of the things that is mentioned is, when I choose a place for my name to dwell, that is the place you will worship. Okay, it's very clear. And when you go and begin to look at the kings, okay, we see Saul's a king like all the other nations have. David is a king who's after God's heart, still messes it up, but is a king after God's heart. Solomon, which then causes the breaking apart of the nation of Israel into a southern kingdom and a northern. Every king that is mentioned in 1 Kings and 2 Kings falls particularly into two categories. And remember, Kings mentions every single king, both north and south. And it will say one of two things. It will say, and they were right, they did right in the eyes of the Lord as their father David did, or they did wicked in the eyes of the Lord as their fathers did. Okay. When you look at the stories in each of them, the determining factor, it does say, there is one that says, well, he did right in the eyes of the Lord, but he didn't do perfect because he did this. Okay. The kings that are called righteous worship the Lord in the place where God had chosen to place his name. It's what Solomon prays in Kings and Chronicles. Let this be the place where your name dwells. Let this be the place where you're listening for us. The northern kingdom never has a single king who was right in the eyes of the Lord. Why? Because Jeroboam, the very first one, he was concerned that he might lose the kingdom that God had given him. Now, this is telling you the mentality. Rehoboam, in punishment for both his attitude and all of that, God tells Jeroboam, because Solomon wasn't faithful, I'm going to take part of the kingdom away from him. And I'm going to give it to you. And if you will obey me, your family will have it forever. First thing he does, well, if these people keep having to go to Jerusalem to worship, then they'll decide to stay in the southern kingdom. We got to stop that. So he built two sets of golden calves, placed one in the southern part of the northern kingdom and one in the northern part of the northern kingdom. And guess what he did? He restarted the idolatry that took place at Mount Sinai. The same exact symbol even. And we walk through and we watch, and no, he was wicked in the eyes of the Lord. He was wicked in the eyes of the Lord. He was wicked in the eyes of the Lord. We get to Ahab, and he goes, and he was more wicked. Okay. And we go forward. Then we come to the next guy who is, I lost the name. Yes. But the next guy kicks them out for all of their idolatry because they moved from just the golden calves to worshiping the Baals and the Asherah. The guy who comes after kicks them out, cuts down all of those, and it says, and he cut down all of those, but he still worshiped the dang golden calves. It's exactly how the Bible phrases it. But he still worshiped the golden calves.
That's crazy.
And as we go forward, then the idolatry creeps its way back in, moves back in, comes back in. Because why? Because they were not committed to worship the Lord as he had commanded them. And the southern kingdom does the same thing. Now, they have the temple. And yet they begin, well, we're going to worship at the temple, but we're also going to worship the Baals, and we're also going to worship the Asherah, and we're also going to worship Molech, and we're also going to worship this, and we're also going to worship that. And so every king, so you go through and fallen into that. They come to Hezekiah, and Hezekiah makes a revival of the nation and reinstates temple worship and gets rid of a bunch of those things. And then when he dies, it falls back away again. And then Josiah comes, and Josiah makes a move to tear down all of that garbage. This would have been the day of Jeremiah, is under the reign of Josiah. However, there are places as we look at Jeremiah, we're going to find out that in some ways, Josiah's reform, while he was real in his turning, that the people kind of turned to give lip service. They did God, they just were worried they would get mad if they did. So they reformed for Josiah. As soon as Josiah dies, they go back. But we also see another reality that goes on there. At Hezekiah, it appears that if they had retained their return to the Lord, that God would have completely turned back the destruction that was coming. Because the prophets are already saying that destruction's coming. At Josiah, what God tells Josiah is, nope, destruction's still coming. But because you are faithful, I'll wait. I'll wait till after you die. You won't see it. Which brings up a very interesting discussion. People who turn back to God in reality, there is a point will turn back, God will relent. There comes a point where people can turn back and God goes, nope, it's too late, but I will delay. I will move the timetable back. But Josiah's children fall right back into all of that. And it's another 4 generations and it's all gone. And not very long. I mean, like I say 4 generations, it's within 50 years. Because several of those kings, their reigns are, a month. And then they get assassinated or Babylon comes or whatever it is. So understand that God is speaking to them at this point going, you haven't turned and I'm going to have to do this because I'm holy and I'm righteous and I'm good and I can't put up with this. I cannot continue to let you do this because you keep evil in your hearts. Now, a primary element is the idolatry, but certainly one of the things that almost certainly is an issue that didn't get mended with Josiah. Josiah made them cut down the poles and cut down the altars and tear down all the altars. But what doesn't appear to be the case is that the oppression of each other stopped. He didn't return them completely to the law to say, here's how you treat one another. They were still cheating one another. They were still mistreating one another. They were still breaking the Sabbath laws. Remember that the reason that the exile is 70 years long is that for the space of 490 years, something to that effect. It's not quite. I think it is 490. But however it is, for 70 consecutive times, they had skipped the Sabbath year rest for the land. So remember, they were to farm for 6 and then they were to let it lay for a 7th year. They weren't doing that. Why? Because they were greedy. What was the purpose of that 7th year rest? Twofold. Number 1, to let the land rest. Number 2, to provide for the poor. Because you did it, because it says, we've discussed this before. If you take a field that you have planted wheat and barley in every year for 6 years, guess what's going to happen if you don't plant? Wheat and barley is going to come up. Especially if you're hand harvesting. Because guess what? You go in, you cut some, and a couple of seeds fall out.
Yeah.
And whenever it comes next year's growing season, it comes up. What it says is you can't go out and harvest it that year. You let it go fallow.
You are allowed.
You
to
don't
eat from it,
plant.
though.
You can
Right.
go out and grab a couple of heads and eat from them.
Yeah.
But what the primary idea was that every 7th year, there was extra grain for the poor and the needy to gather and collect for themselves. More so than there would have any of the other years. Because the other years you went out and harvested. But remember, and this is another thing they almost certainly were breaking. God had told them, when you go out and you pick, whenever you harvest the barley, when you harvest the wheat, when you pick the grapes, when you pick the olives, when you do all of these things, you do not make a second pass. Ever. So you go through and you gather up a bundle of barley, you cut it off and get ready to bind it, and a few stems of barley fall on the ground. By Jewish law, you are not allowed to pick that up.
You see that even today in wheat fields, when they combine and wheat will come up volunteer.
But what was the purpose of it? Well, one of it is the volunteer discussion, but even more so is, what do we see in the book of Ruth? We see Ruth walking behind the reapers. What is she doing? She's watching for all the stalks they drop and all the heads of grain they drop. And think about the grapevines. Okay, you have a very fruitful grapevine. Are you going to get every grape off of it? No. Fig trees, you can get every fig off? No. Now, the thing we find in Ruth, and it's a critical element because it tells us, because remember, Ruth takes place in the time of the judges. And the judges is a wicked time in Israel. What does Boaz tell Ruth? This field. Why? Because the children of Israel had fallen away from where God wanted them. And there was a risk if she went to another field that she might get beat up, she might get raped, she is a young woman, probably, and the Bible even says she was beautiful. She would have been taken advantage of. Boaz is a godly man, and he says, no, it is her right to be here. And in fact, he tells them what? He says, accidentally drop some extra. And then he tells her what else? He says, you walk right among these women who are over here gleaning. And whenever it comes time to lunchtime, you go come and eat with them. You come get water whenever you want. You do whatever you need to do, because let me be fair. We some of you know better than I that harvesting by hand isn't easy. Especially whenever when you're just going through for looking for leftovers. And you're desperate to find just enough to feed you. And Boaz goes, throw her some extra. Take care of her. Now, one thing we need to understand is, remember that he's related to Naomi. What does he tell her is the reason that he's being so good to her? Because you've been good to Naomi. You have been good to this woman who is part of my family. You have been God's protection. You have been part of God's God's will in her life. And so let me help take care of you. The thing that she says to him when he asks him to redeem her. He says, now let it be your wing I fall under. Because as we get earlier, and I know we've chased a huge rabbit, I'm sorry. But when he talks to her at first, he says, may the Lord put you under his wings for what you have done for Naomi. And then he provides extra for her. Then when she comes and lays at his feet, put me under your wing, Boaz. It's the same discussion. Now, Boaz, I want you to be God's tool to protect me and Naomi. And remember, it doesn't give us exacts, but it's very clear in the way the Bible is talking is that Boaz is in his 40s or 50s. And Ruth is a 20, 25-year-old woman. And probably was the talk of Bethlehem. Because one of the things he tells her after that, he goes, blessed are you for not trying to go after one of the young men, but instead coming to me. Now, I'm going to be fair. We like to romanticize that story and say, oh, they fell in love and all of that. That is not how the Bible portrays it. It is a transactional thing.
Yeah.
It is Naomi and Ruth. Now, my humble opinion, I think they probably did fall in love. I don't think it's the same kind of romantic love that we often think of, love at first sight and all that. It's the biblical form of love. They sacrificed for one another. They cared about one another. They met each other's needs. And I think it's important that we understand that that's part of this. Well, now we're looking at in contrast. They're taking advantage of each other. Instead of being like Boaz, who at his own cost, now was it a huge cost? No. But at his own cost, he provided for her. Now, once he becomes her kinsman redeemer, it's actually quite a bit bigger cost. Because the baby is not only the heir of Naomi's son, he has now become the first for Boaz. So not only does he, that's why the other guy didn't want to marry her. When you read the story, that's the discussion. He says there's another who's closer and I have to talk to him first. Why does he not want to redeem? Because by taking Ruth as his wife and bearing her a kid, then he becomes his heir as well, which means that if he's got other kids, then Ruth's baby's taking away from their inheritance. And he goes, oh no, I can't do that. What's he really saying? Oh no, I'm not that willing to follow God. Don't miss it. And Ruth goes, okay. And then Boaz goes, okay, I'll marry her. Not a heartbeat. I got it. And so Obed, who's the son, becomes the heir of both Naomi's husband and Boaz. The most important character in Jewish history. Well, second most. Because where does that lineage go after David?
Jesus.
All the way to Jesus. So the reason I bring this up is because it's a contrast now. Because in contrast, now they are not willing to give up anything to help their fellow man. They're not willing to step out at all to help their fellow man. In fact, they take advantage of them. And so this idea, because it comes back to the whole discussion of harvest. This says the Lord of hosts. Now remember what that means. The Lord of the army of heaven. They shall glean thoroughly as a vine, the remnant of Israel. Like a grape gatherer, pass your hand again over its branches. So this is what he means. You know that thing you weren't allowed to do so that you could take care of the poor? Yeah, they're going to go back through again and make sure they catch anything they missed. Will I speak and give warning that here? And then comes a very interesting phrasing, and understand this is the point of this. Behold, their ears are uncircumcised, they cannot listen. Now, what is circumcision?
An outward
Cutting
sign
away.
that you follow God.
So what is it physically, though?
Oh, it's
It's a
where,
cleansing.
no, it's where they cut the skin off.
Okay, so there is, at birth, an extra layer of skin
Yeah.
over the male private parts. And they go in and they cut that off. So I want you to see the picture. Their ears are uncircumcised. They feel a skin sticking over ears that doesn't allow them to hear anything. Is exactly the picture that God is giving.
Pretty direct.
It's uncircumcision was, but I didn't know what you were getting.
That's what he's saying. Your ears are uncircumcised. You have this massive flap of skin sticking over your ears so that no one can hear you. You can't hear anybody.
Like you
Ye-
don't get it.
What?
Is it like you don't get it?
Oh, yeah, they don't even hear it. Not only do they not get it, they don't hear it.
Okay.
The second line there, they cannot listen. So in our culture, it would be the la 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 la, you know, how a kid does when they don't want to listen. I still laugh because my niece is deaf and sign language is her primary language. And when she doesn't want to listen to her mom, she closes her eyes. I'll tell you another one of those. Whenever we played football against the School of the Deaf, they couldn't hear the whistle. So there was a visual signal for the play's dead. And they would have every once in a while a lineman who would just shut his eyes so that he wouldn't see the sign. Okay. But that's the picture. Your ears are uncircumcised, you cannot listen. Behold, the word of the Lord is to them an object of scorn. They hate the law. They hate what God has told them. They hate the rules that God has set, and they take no pleasure in it. That's what therefore means, because it's true. I am full of the wrath of the Lord. I am weary of holding it back. So this is there's a comedian many years ago who joked around about, you know, family and kids and having a big family, and said, you know, they'd have dinner, and after dinner they would tell them to go up and take a bath, and they give very specific instructions, you know, use soap, dry yourself off, you know, all of that. And said that, you know, they'd go upstairs and you to hear things, and then the way he joked about it, he goes, there would come the point where mom would announce that tonight's beatings were about to begin. And the words that she would use were, I have had enough of this. And that meant the beatings were going to start. Okay. That is exactly what God is saying. I am so angry that I am tired of holding it back. And then it says it this way, pour it out upon the children in the street and upon the gatherings of young men also. Both husband and wife shall be taken, the elderly and the very aged. Their houses shall be turned over to others, their fields and wives together. For I will stretch out my hand against the land, declares the Lord. Now, I'm going to make a point here. We're going to stop here at 12, but I want to make a point here. This phrasing, for I will stretch out my hand against the inhabitants of the land, is almost the exact thing he tells Moses he's going to do to Egypt. For I will stretch out my hand. I will move against them. The power of God saying, I told you what you were supposed to do. I gave you chance after chance after chance after chance after chance. Every warning I could give. And you stopped up your ears. And you didn't listen. And you didn't see. And so the only way that I can wake you up is to move against you.
It's like enough is enough.
Well, it's the discuss this before. There is a reality in the idea that often things in our life are like an alarm, that we're not doing what God says, and so something happens in our lives and we go, oh my gosh, I can't believe that happened. What is God? Why did God allow that to happen? What it is wake up.
So wake up.
What are you doing?
And what we often do is we go over here and we hit the snooze button and we keep going. And a little bit later, God goes, okay, and he turns the heat up another notch and goes, wake up. And we snooze it again. We go a little bit further. This time he turns the heat up a little more. Wake up. Kind of how sometimes we have to deal with our kids when they don't want to wake up in the morning for school, right? You go in at the time they're supposed to get up and go, hey, time to get up, get ready, get all that. And then 20 minutes later, you come and find they've fallen back asleep. You don't respond the same way. Okay.
I can hear my mom.
And eventually, if they keep doing it over and over again, eventually you have to go in and shake the fire out of them and get your butt up now. Do not stay laid down. You get up now no matter what.
I threatened to pour water on
And-
my daughter.
or water or whatever it is. So we come back to, we're going to take just a moment before picture of one of the prophecies in Isaiah, and it says, I sent calamity against you, and instead of waking up, you proclaim that you're just going to build it back better.
Yeah.
And
What we said.
and we have to deal with this. After 9/11, we did the exact same thing. Oh, we're just going to build back better. Not recognizing when we said it that we were speaking a judgment of God over us. It's going to get worse because whenever I tried to wake you, instead of waking and turning back to me, you bowed up. Right? It's the calling out dad moment. Right? Dad goes to discipline because you're doing something you want, and you go, I don't, and you puff out your chest and tell dad, where he can go. What's the next thing that's going to happen? It's not going to be fun for you. And that's what God is getting at. I've done everything to wake you up, and you won't wake up, and you won't listen, and you won't turn, and you won't return to me, and you won't do anything. So now it's time for me to employ drastic measures. Because I have had enough of this. All right, so we'll pick up at verse 13 next